Welcome to Crypto 101, an introduction to cryptography. I'm LVH. If you want to contact me, I'm at LVH on Twitter, and pretty much anything at lvh.cc if you want to email me. I'm not going to be showing any crazy mad science in crypto. This is all current day applicable stuff, although I do have a lot of stuff, so I apologize if it goes so quickly. Here's the lightning talk version. If you have data that is currently being transmitted, use TLS. If you have data that's not being transmitted and you want to encrypt it, then use GPG. If you're typing the letters AES into your code anywhere, you're doing it wrong. If you're typing the letters DES, then you're extra wrong. And if you're typing the letters MD5 or SHA, then you're likely wrong. So why should you still stay? Well, first of all, because recognizing wrong stuff still matters. And understanding stuff still matters. Because otherwise, for example, that would be kind of like saying, hey, I want a blog, and somebody answers, well, use Python. That's a technically correct answer, and it's completely useless. So let me start with something very simple, XOR. So XOR, or exclusive OR, basically means OR like we use it in most languages. It means one thing or the other thing, but not both and not neither. So for example, 1 XOR 0 is 1, and 0 XOR 1 is 1 because they're not the same. And if you do it with the same values, then you get 0. One way to think of this is a programmable inverter. So you take the input, and the thing on top says, should I invert this or not? And then you have the output. So for example, 1, and the thing up top is 1, so that it means invert, so the output's 0. If you don't invert, then the output's still 1. Very, very simple. Now you can use this to do something called a one-time pad. What's a one-time pad? It's essentially a very, very long string of 1s and 0s. And what you do is you take your input on the left and you use this programmable inverter with the one-time pad, and then you have your output on the end. And it turns out that this actually gives you perfect secrecy. Why? Because if an attacker sees a 1 on the output, he has no idea if that's a 1 that didn't get inverted or if it's a 1 that did get inverted. So basically, there's no way for the attacker to know, did this start out as a 1 or a 0, so it's perfectly secret. So, victory, crypto is over, we can all go home, except, of course, not quite. Because the length of this one-time pad, of course, then has to be the length of all data that you're ever going to send. So that is a very, very big number, which of course leads to problems in terms of key exchange, because that means that, for example, even if I only want to talk to all of the people in the room, I have to give all of you like these Blu-ray discs with stupid amounts of random numbers. So how do we fix that? Well, ciphers. First of all, block ciphers. What's a block cipher? It's a thing that takes some plain text of fixed size on the left, and it has a key, and on the output is something of the same fixed size, and it's called a ciphertext. And basically, for every possible such block on the left side, there is exactly one ciphertext on the other side. Because of this, it's sometimes called a random permutation, because it basically takes all of the possible blocks and permutes them and maps them from one possible block to another possible block. So here's a practical example for a 3-bit block cipher. So basically, every possible sequence of 3 bits is on the left, and it's mapped to a different one on the right. And if you want to encrypt, then you find your thing on the left, and you take the thing on the right. And if you want to decrypt, you do the opposite thing. Now, what's important about a block cipher is that if I show you X and then the message encrypted with that block cipher, so C with some key in X, then you know absolutely nothing about what's going to happen if I take a different input. So basically, you can see I can give you all of these inputs, and essentially you should have virtually no information about what it means for other inputs. Now, what you use for block ciphers, really the only real answer here is AES. It's the standard for a reason. It's called the Advanced Encryption Standard, and it's pretty much it's fine. It's good for all purposes. Blowfish, Twofish, and more recently 3Fish is also a good solution. But honestly, other than you want to be special, there really is no reason to pick anything other than AES. So it's not wrong to use this, but there's really no good reason to not pick the standard one. Deaths and triple deaths have been used a lot in the past, and unfortunately continue to be used. And they're pretty much broken, and you shouldn't use them ever, especially not in new stuff. So now, victory, right? Because we solved this key problem. because now I can send this message, hello, and it goes through the block cipher, and the output looks like random noise to an attacker, has no idea what I said. So I can send it to anyone in the room as long as they have this fairly tiny secret key. So that's easy enough to exchange. So after I send hello, I want to send you an image. So I open up an image and I try to send it to you. Turns out that doesn't work. Why? Because the thing I just showed you is a block cipher. It encrypts blocks. It takes blocks of a fixed size and it outputs blocks of a fixed size. Now, the length of that message is bigger than the block size. For AES, the block size is 128 bits, so that's 16 bytes. So hello fits in there, but most JPEG images don't. So we need something that can encrypt things bigger than 16 bytes because we'd like to send real messages. And for that, we have stream ciphers. Now, stream ciphers are generally implemented as a construction with block ciphers. There's a few counterexamples. There's stream ciphers that actually are only stream ciphers, for example, RC4. But they tend to have a lot of problems. So in practice, the ones that are used the most are implemented as a construction with block ciphers. So if you think about this for about 5 minutes, then you think, okay, well, that's easy. I mean, I have my long message, and I just encrypt every single small part of it with a block cipher, and then I have the output, and I just take that all together. And if it turns out that at the end my message doesn't really fit into one block, then I just pad it with a bunch of zeros, and then we're done, right? Well, it turns out other people have thought of this too, and this is called ECB, or Electronic Code Book. Now, what's the issue with ECB? That if you have the same block, then it will be encrypted to the same ciphertext. So if you have the same block 10 times, then you will get the same ciphertext 10 times in your ciphertext stream. Now, that might not really sound like a problem because, the output of the block is seemingly random, right? Well, let's say that you have a bitmap, because with a bitmap, it's really easy to demonstrate. So I have the Python logo here. And then I encrypt it with something with a block size of 5 pixels. So assuming that it was a real bitmap, that would be approximately AES's block size. Then you get something like this. Obviously, some things happen to it, but I wouldn't say that this is a very valuable form of encryption. It's very obviously still the Python logo. And if you increase the block size, fine, it gets a little fuzzier, but it's still not very good. Ideally, you'd want it to look like, well, pretty much this, random noise, right? Another issue with this is replay attacks. What's a replay attack? A replay attack is an attack where you say something that you've seen before without necessarily really understanding what it is or being able to construct that message yourself. For example, let's say that there's a nightclub on the Gluvny, and there's a bouncer and there's a password because it's a very, very, very high-profile party. Of course, I don't know the password. Nobody told me. But I see someone else go in, and I hear the word Vutnik. I think I'm pronouncing that right. Now, I have no idea that that means swordfish, but I don't need to know that it means swordfish. I just need to say the same word again to that bouncer, and he'll believe me and even if I don't know what it means, he'll let me in. So earlier I talked about a construction using block ciphers. These are called block cipher modes of operation. And here's a couple of examples. So ECB is the bad one that we've already talked about. And then there's CBC and CTR, which I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about. The other two are pretty obscure and you probably don't care about them. So CBC is interesting because it's probably the most common one in the wild. So it's called cipher block chaining. The exact construction doesn't really matter. One reason it's interesting is that recently there was an attack on SSL called Beast. And so it's an attack on, TLS version 1.0. And the reason it works, it's not because CBC itself is broken, but the particular way that SSL or TLS 1.0 uses CBC involving initialization vectors, basically this particular way that they use it is broken. So this actually is used by most encrypted connections on the internet, and that's a practical attack on it. The other mode I want to talk about is CTR. So CTR is counter mode, is short for counter mode. And what does that mean? You have a nonce, which is basically a short little piece of random data. And then you have a count, and you pad that, and then you have something like this. Right? So you have the nonce, it's always the same, and then you have a count, you start at 0, 1, 2. Right? And then what you do is you encrypt every single one of them. Now remember, I told you what's important about a block cipher. If you know the output for one of them, then you don't know anything else about the output for any other one of them. So, for example, the output for the nonce plus all zeros looks absolutely nothing like the output for the nonce and then a 1 padded. And then you have this stream of seemingly random numbers. This is actually a very, very good, this is what's called a cryptographically secure random number generator, so it's pretty good. It has stronger properties than a regular one. And basically you use this, that's called a key stream, and you use this as a pseudo one-time pad. So you use it exactly the same way that you'd use a one-time pad. You take all of the bits in the key stream and then you XOR them with your plain text, and then the output is, again, seemingly random because you XORed it with something that's seemingly random. Now, here's a bunch of other modes of operation. What's special about them is that they don't just encrypt, they also authenticate. Because of that, they're a lot more complicated. And there's only one that's even remotely interesting to look at. Why? Because all of the other ones pretty much are patent encumbered, and that means that unless you have a lot of money, you can't really use them. So, yeah. Anyway, victory, because now we have these encrypted connections and I can send messages of arbitrary size to anyone I want, right? Well, there's still a couple of problems. For example, key exchange. Let's say that we do that in person. So that means that if we have a bunch of people, and this is less people than there are in the room right here, right now, then each of these people has to exchange a key with every other person in the group. So obviously that's O of n squared, and on the internet that's not really going to work. Even in a small group like this, that's already incredibly hectic, but on the internet where there's billions of people and billions of servers talking to each other, it's just not going to happen. Another issue is key reuse. It's not necessarily the case that just because you have this one tiny key and you manage to securely communicate with each other, that if you start sending, petabytes or exabytes of data over that connection with the same key, that it remains secure. So, how are we going to fix that? A little thing called Diffie-Hellman key exchange. This is only one example of a key exchange algorithm, but I'm going to show it because it's one of the originals, and also I have a nice analogy for being able to explain it using colors. So whenever I'm talking about a color, it's actually happening with a number, but if I had to do it with a number, then I would have to explain a bunch of math, and if I just explain it with colors, then it's a lot easier. So, colors. One thing that I assume is that I can mix colors. So I can add yellow and blue and get something greenish. Second thing that I assume is that the order in which I mix colors doesn't matter. So if I mix yellow and blue or blue and yellow, it's the same thing. The third important thing is that even if there's no way of splitting colors. Even if you have two colors, then you can't tell what color I have to add to one of them to get the other. So once colors are mixed, they never come apart again. Okay. So let's say we have my computer on the left, the internet with evil hackers in the middle, and you on the right. Okay? And we start with a public key, which is yellow. And we give this key to everyone. We spread this key along the internet. Everyone can know what it is. Okay? So I have yellow, the internet has yellow, you have yellow. Then I pick a secret color, and I mix the two. So I pick blue, and I get green. This is all happening on my computer. You also pick a different secret color, probably, and you mix the two and you get this orange. The next thing we do is we send them to each other. So basically that means we're sending this over an unencrypted connection, so the entire internet, as you can see above, the entire internet can now see the public key and our two mixed colors. What I didn't do is I add my secret color to the mixed color that I got from you, and you add your secret color again to the mixed color that you got from me. Now, that means that we end up with the same color. Why? Because if you do what I do, you start with a public one and you add my secret and then your secret, obviously that's going to be the same thing as when you start with the public one, you add your secret and then you add my secret. So this ends up working because the order doesn't matter, and it's okay that the mixed colors are on the public internet because there's no way of separating the colors again. When I say there's no way, what that mathematically translates to is that it would require an obscene amount of processing power in order to actually do that. So we're assuming that there's nobody on the planet today. Maybe there's aliens with more processing power than we have, but nobody on Earth today can actually decrypt this. So victory, because now, victory, except no, not quite. Because what if there's a hacker in the middle? And first, he does a Diffie-Hellman key exchange with me. And we agree on this purple key. And then he does a Diffie-Hellman key exchange with you, and you agree on this blue key. There's no way for me to ever, even if I knew that there was a hacker in the middle, there's no way ever that I could convince you otherwise, because, well, that guy is the guy with the keys to check out. I'm just this random guy who has this random color from somewhere that you've never heard of. So there's no way for me to either know or convince you that there's anyone in the middle. And this could be a problem, for example, because if I send a message ceasefire and it goes across the wire perfectly encrypted, the guy in the middle can decrypt it, sees ceasefire, and then he sends you attack at dawn and he uses the right key, so it all looks like it works out. So what we're missing here is authenticity. We need to be able to verify that the sender is the expected sender and that the message is the expected message. So in order to do that, I'm going to have to sort of wander off the path for a little bit, and I'm going to talk about cryptographic hash functions. What's a cryptographic hash function? It's something that takes an input of arbitrary size, and it gives you a digest, also sometimes called the internal state, of fixed size. Examples of this would be SHA-2, MD5, anything like that. Now, what does a hash function say it does? First of all, computing a hash function should be really, really easy. So if I give you any string, then you can compute the hash in virtually no time. Going the other way, so finding a message that has a given hash should be extremely complicated. Also, when you change the message, even by 1 bit, then with overwhelming probability, you will get a completely different hash value. So changing the message in a way that would give you the same hash value isn't possible. And finally, oh, actually, that's this slide. So changing the input in a way that doesn't change the output is essentially impossible. That's it. Unfortunately, sometimes people use it and assume that it has other properties that it doesn't actually have. For example, the hash value of x can actually be used to compute the hash value of some value related to x without me actually knowing x. For example, the most common version of this is extension attacks. So let's say that I have a hash function, and I'm using roughly the API that's in HashLib, so the Python Standard Library module. So I create a hash function, and I start it with hello Pyconic, and I add some text Dzień, and then I take the hex digest value. Okay. Now, the actual HashLib API in Python does not have this API. There's no technical reason other than you shouldn't have a good reason to do this. Let's say that I initialize a hash function with initial state, the hash that I see from you. And then I can update it with my string and take the digest. So my string could be something like, I'm not attending because I've switched to PHP. And then suddenly the output value matches completely. It's exactly the same as if you had written the text from scratch and you had taken that hash value, and it looks exactly the same. A practical example of this being done wrong is a payment processor that I've had to deal with recently, and they do something to the tune of MD5 value of secret plus amount, and you add that to a request when you make a transaction, and that's the way they authenticate that you really said, oh, well, I want a transaction for this amount. The way they encode money amounts is you take basically the number of cents, so $12 is 1,200. So what that means is if I see you sign a request for $1, then I take the state of your hash, add 12 zeros to the end, and then take the hex digest, and that is actually a valid key, and if you make a transaction with that, that will check out completely. So obviously that wasn't really a very good use case of a cryptographic hash function. If you want to play with this, if you want to play with hash extension attacks, there's hash pump. You can get it off of GitHub. So this is not really deep magic. You can download things off of GitHub that will pretty much do it for you. So what should you use if you want to use a hash function? SHA-256, so that's SHA-2, 256-bit size, or SHA-3, both of them are fine. SHA-3 very, very recently came out, mostly because we were expecting SHA-2 to be broken faster, but actually SHA-2 is still doing fine. So, there's no real, if you're using SHA-256 and you're using it correctly, there's no reason to move to SHA-3. So that brings me to password storage, because hash functions is something that people often use for password storage. Let me start by saying that cryptographic hash functions for password storage are simply wrong. There is no good reason to be doing this. It looks okay, but it's actually completely broken. Now, people think it's okay because, like I said, if you know a hash, then you can't go back to the password. So if someone steals your entire password database, well, they see all of these hashes, and obviously they can't go back to the password because that's what the hash function says, right? Except maybe we can brute force it. Maybe we can just try all of the passwords. Because remember, going from the hash value, going from the plain text to the hash value, really, really easy, only takes a couple of cycles. Well, you have these things, which have roughly the air displacement and noise of a vacuum cleaner, and they compute about 5.5 billion MD5 hashes per second and 2.5 billion SHA-2 hashes per second, and this is 2-year-old technology. So people think, well, maybe SHA-3 will fix it. Well, like I said, a hash function is supposed to be really good at going from the plain text to the hash value. So this is supposed to be fast. And actually, SHA-3 makes it worse because SHA-2 takes about 25 cycles per byte on then current Intel CPU. SHA-3 takes about 5 cycles per byte on a current, I think it's AMD CPU. Anyway, my point is SHA-3 is faster than SHA-2. So no, it doesn't fix the problem. It makes it worse. Salts? Well, salts only defend against dictionary attacks. Salts are only good if I'm trying to compute all of the hash values up front. But with modern technology, like, for example, that video card, I don't have to. As soon as I steal your password database, and therefore also have all of your nonces and salts, then I can just try all values again, starting with the salt. So it doesn't really do anything. A key derivation function, which is the thing that you should use for a password storage database. Well, actually, you shouldn't store passwords at all. You should use something like Mozilla Persona or I don't know, Facebook Connect or Twitter accounts or something. Whatever it is that you need to do to make sure that storing passwords is somebody else's problem. But if you do have to store passwords, then you should use a key derivation function. One of those that you could use is bcrypt. Bcrypt is tunably time hard. So basically, bcrypt takes this parameter, and if you increase the number, if you make the number bigger, then bcrypt takes longer to compute. So basically, it becomes more difficult to find that password value. So even as computers get faster, that's okay. You just change the number, you make it a little bit bigger, and then suddenly it still takes longer again. scrypt is even better. scrypt is the one I recommend. It's not only time hard, so it takes a long time to compute, it's also space hard, so you need a lot of memory to compute it. Like, for example, we're talking order of magnitude megabytes. Now, for a big server with like, maybe almost 200 gigabytes worth of RAM, that doesn't really matter. However, if you're an attacker and you're trying to attack, millions of passwords or even billions of passwords, then that 1 megabyte does matter. Next thing I want to talk about is message authentication codes, or MACs. Now, remember I said a hash value of X can be used to compute a hash value of a related thing to X. But if you know the MAC, if you know a MAC value, then that says absolutely nothing about any other related thing. The thing you should use for that is HMAC, which is a construction based on hashes, and it takes a key, it's a symmetric key, it takes a hash function, takes a message. This is in the Python standard library, so you have no excuse not to use it. Just import HMAC. But that, of course, leaves us with one big problem that I said earlier. I mean, maybe we can authenticate the message now. Sorry, maybe we can verify that the message hasn't changed. We use a MAC. But that doesn't mean that I've authenticated the sender. It doesn't mean that I've actually verified that this person that I'm talking to is actually the person I think it is. And what we're going to use for that is a tool from public key cryptography. What's public key cryptography? Public key cryptography is cryptography where, unlike in the previous examples, like with a block cipher, you have one key. And that key is the same for encrypting and decrypting. Public key cryptography, keys come as pairs. So there's a public key, there's a private key. Private key is only for me. Public key I give out to everyone. And the idea is that these keys are related, but they're not the same. And we've actually already given an example of a public key algorithm because Diffie-Hellman, with the colors, the yellow key, which was available to everyone, is nothing else than a public key, and the two secret colors are, you could argue, secret keys. Now, key generation is something that you do in a public key algorithm. It's very easy. Everyone can do it. So basically, that means that I make a key pair. So the red is the private one, the green is the public one. You make a key pair, same thing, very easy. You can do it on, actually, probably most of you, I imagine, have already done this on your computers, even if maybe you didn't realize it. And then what we can do is I can put my public key everywhere. I put it in the cloud, because the internet is a cloud these days. And you do the same thing with your public key. You just put it everywhere, and everybody puts their keys on the public internet. Now, how do we encrypt with that? Well, we have this public key encryption function. It looks a lot like the block cipher function, and I have some input text, and it changes it into some output text. Okay, easy enough. And then decryption, this is where you come in. Notice that the big difference with the block cipher is that you're not using the public key anymore. You're using your own private key, which you don't give to anyone else, and then you get the output text back. You can also use this to sign things. So basically, the equivalent of signature, essentially you're just saying, this thing that I am saying is something that I have said. You know that I have said it because I'm using my private key, and the only person to have my private key is me. You can check that it was done using my private key. Therefore, it must have been said by me. So anyone can use my public key. How do I know you're you? Well, the way you do that is you take, so I'm saying it's the hash value of M. In most secure cases, it's a little bit more, particularly for RSA, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but let's just pretend that it's pretty much just a hash value. And you decrypt it. It sounds like you're encrypting, but you decrypt it using your own private key, and then you create a signature. And then what I can do is, using your public key, which is publicly available to me, I can decrypt the signature, and I can verify that that is indeed the hash value of the message that you sent me. And then I know, even if the message itself is in plain text, then I do know that you sent it, or at least whoever had the private key sent it. Now, what's the algorithm for that? So RSA is probably the most common one. It stands for demo blackout, sorry. Shamir Abelman, and I'm completely forgetting the first R, sorry. So victory, because now, well, except that now, of course, we have no way of saying that me is actually me. I mean, if you find, let's say that you make a key and you put it on the public internet and you say that it was made by LVH, but there's no way for someone else who then wants to send me email, you get this public key off the internet, it says that it's from LVH, the email address checks out, but anyone could have made that key. There's no checking that it really is me. How do you do that? How do you verify that it actually is me? Invariably, this ends up happening with chains of signatures. So let's say that I start by saying, I don't trust you, but X trusts you. We have a mutual friend that does trust you, and I do trust X, and if that person says that you really are you, then I trust his judgment, and I therefore conclude that, you're trustworthy and you are who you say you are. And this is precisely how GPG key signing works. So there are these key signing parties. I don't know if everyone's heard of those, but essentially it's these places, like it could be at a PyConic meeting, and everyone has a GPG key, and everybody checks each other's passports and checks that with the actual key, and they say, oh, well, that person is really who they say they are, so let's sign their key. And then when other people go and find my public key on the internet, they say, well, I don't know if this is the right key, but it was signed by Mihal's key, and I know Mihal. Mihal, gave me his key at a recent PyConic meeting, so problem solved. Now, which brings me to SSL. Now, SSL or TLS, TLS is basically just what it's called after Netscape stopped. So SSL was originally designed by Netscape, and then it stopped being managed by the Netscape Corporation, and then it was called TLS. So they're essentially the same thing. TLS is just newer. And what I'm about to say is pretty much only about how, well, not only, but primarily about how TLS is implemented in browsers, because that's the platform that I assume most of you will be dealing most with when it comes to TLS. So how does TLS work? Well, first, I talk to some server, and I say, well, okay, so I'm using TLS version blah, 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 and I support cipher suites blah, blah, blah. What's a cipher suite? It's a sequence, it's a bunch of algorithms that I am capable of using to have secure communications with you. It includes a key exchange method, usually RSA, but Diffie-Hellman is another example of a key exchange method that it's used by TLS. It has a signing algorithm, so you can use RSA, and there's two other standards there. It has a bulk encryption algorithm, so for example, AES-CBC, which is AES, the one that I talked about, so that's, and RC4 is stream cipher, so that's for actually encrypting the data. and then a MAC algorithm for authenticating the data, for making sure that the data is actually what I intended it to be. And that's usually HMAC with MD5 or SHA. Then the server answers with its versions and its cipher suites, because obviously there's no point in me supporting this fancy encryption algorithm or this fancy signing algorithm if the server doesn't speak it. Obviously we need to find a compatible protocol. And it also sends a thing called its certificate. What I then do is I verify the certificate. How that works, I'll explain in a little bit. And then I take a random value. I take a random secret. I encrypt it using the server's public key, which was included in the certificate. I encrypt it, and I create this output stream, and I send it back to the server. And the server decrypts it, and now it also has a random secret. And then what we do is take the random secret, and I turn it into symmetric keys. I turn it into an AES key, and I turn it into a MAC key. Server does the same thing. It has the same random secret, so it can create the same AES and MAC keys. And now we have secure communication, because it's encrypted and it's authenticated. It's encrypted with the AES key. I gave AES as a practical example. RC4 is also a very, very common SSL algorithm. It's also authenticated. I use HMAC, and we have a MAC key that we use to authenticate the messages. Now, of course, the big problem here is how do we do this certificate verification step? Because I was sort of hand-waving there. We just have to assume that it works. Well, how does it work? How come that what I illustrated earlier with Diffie-Hellman, how come that can't work this time? Why can't the hacker in the middle pretend to be the server? Well, that works using a system called certificate authorities, or CAs. And they have this chain of signatures, very similar to the chain of signatures that I was explaining earlier with GPG. Except the big difference is that with GPG, you tend to get the signatures by interacting with individual human beings that you trust. And with CAs, they came on your computer. When you bought it or when you downloaded a browser, it came with a bunch of certificates. So there's this chain of trust. And here's an example of this chain of trust. What happens when I point my Firefox browser at Wikipedia, and you see these. So at the bottom, you have start.wikipedia.org, which is signed by DigiCert High Assurance CA3. Now, my computer doesn't trust DigiCert High Assurance CA3, but it's okay because that one is signed by a different certificate by DigiCert High Assurance EV Root CA. Now, it says there root CA. It's not actually a root CA on my machine. It's just root CA for DigiCert. So it is possible that there are machines out there that actually trust DigiCert High Assurance EV as a root CA, but mine doesn't. And then finally, it's signed by GTE Cyber Trust Global Root, which is apparently one that I do have on my machine. And basically, my computer checks this bunch of signatures, and it decides, oh, well, I can communicate safely with Wikipedia, and Wikipedia is Wikipedia because it's signed by this guy, and that thing is signed by that guy, and that thing is signed by that guy, and I can find it back to this CyberTrust Global Root thing, and CyberTrust would never sign something bad, so, we're good. Except, of course, maybe not all root certificates are really so much to be trusted. For example, on Macs, and actually on plenty of machines, and Mozilla has chosen to accept this root certificate as well, there's the China Internet Network Information Center, I think it is, so CINIC. Now, the question is, do you want to trust the Chinese government to be able to sign arbitrary certificates? It's an honest question. I mean, because the consequence of this is that if your machine trusts this, and the Chinese government decides that it wants to fake your bank, or it wants to fake Facebook, or whatever, it can, and it will be cryptographic. It'll look perfectly fine in your browser. There's absolutely no sign that it's anyone other than who they're claiming to be. So, they're saying it's valid, but does that mean it's trustworthy? Perhaps I'm being a little bit cynical, but maybe that's because the acronym for CIN actually says CINIC. Anyway, these guys have been shown to, these guys have authored malware and have installed malware on people's machines. Does that mean we should let them sign root certificates? Even worse, I'm from Belgium. I wouldn't trust the Belgian government, but for some reason your computer does. I have no idea how the hell this happened, but for some reason everyone has a root CA from Belgium that apparently they trust for some reason. Plus, I don't even have to be some government. What if I plant a root trait? What if you're using a machine from work and the system administrator has decided to install a root certificate on that machine that you have no idea is there, and secretly he's man-in-the-middling all of your traffic. You have no idea, and your browser will tell you, oh, well, everything is secure. And this is actually not that far-fetched, because if you use Squid, which probably is one of the most common proxies, particularly for sort of office setups, then there's a module that you can install. It's called SSL. I don't even think you need to install it. It comes in a default install. It's called SSL Bump, and it will do exactly this. It will basically just hijack SSL connections. You can then change whatever data is going through. You can filter whatever data is going through with the standard tools. And if you want something a little more benign that you want to play with, I wrote something called Minitrue. You can get it off of GitHub. It's essentially a proxy designed to lie. You use it as an HTTP proxy, and then for some pages it will decide to return some different content instead of what the web page actually says. And I think that's actually, well, I have a few other, I have slides about timing attacks, and I have some extra stuff about TLS, depending on what people are interested in. But are there any questions?
So what's next? What's when you decide that root certificates are bad?
So there's a couple of alternatives to it. So actually, this is, whatever, I'll do it without the slides. There's a couple of alternatives to that. For example, one that you could probably look at is confluence.io. Essentially, the idea is there's no reason why this thing that we use for GPG, so the idea that, oh, well, basically the only big difference is that with SSL, your machine decides who you trust. With GPG, you decide who you trust. There's no technical reason why the GPG way shouldn't work for TLS. It's just the way it happens. So you can, so it's a pretty elaborate website. They explain how it works, but essentially it's simply that idea applied to SSL certificates. Secondly, if you control both the client and the server, there is nothing stopping. First of all, you can add client certificates. So basically, in the way I explain TLS now is the way it works when you, I don't know, surf to Wikipedia. And in that case, the client does not send a certificate. Why does the client not send a certificate? Wikipedia doesn't care who you are. It just wants to get data to you, and it wants to get data to you securely. It doesn't matter who you are because everyone's supposed to be able to access Wikipedia. If that's not the case, then you can use, you can add a client certificate. Now, what you can additionally do is you can create your own certificate authority. So if you probably have OpenSSL, the command line tool, on your machine. It's incredibly, it's actually one of the few things in the world that's harder to use from the command line than Git. But you can, eventually you sort of get this certificate out, and the certificate authority out. You can use that to sign your own keys. And then what you can do is you give the client a client certificate, which you sign with your key, and you have your own server certificate, and then you can use those to not use any of these root CAs or any of the other CAs, and you can use that to communicate securely. So if you're in control of both ends, then that's what I recommend you do. Unfortunately, if you have to talk to users over the web, there's no, and with good reason, you shouldn't be able to install root CAs into their machine because then you can fake everyone. But of course, then you pretty much have to use the way as it works right now. So maybe in the future this will change, but unfortunately, sort of right now, pretty much everyone's stuck paying. I don't know how much it is for an EV certificate, but like basically stuck paying money.
Right. And so, what about maybe China is trustworthy, but what if it's like a lousy key holder and they lose their key or they give it to someone that's not trustworthy?
Well, there's actually, for example, there's a case, I forget the name of the CA, but so there was this big company, or not even that big a company, and what they wanted to do is they wanted to do the thing that I was talking about. They wanted to man in the middle their own employees, and some CA decided to sign a certificate for them that said that they were also a CA, and it wasn't even to make it possible for them to man in the middle of everything. The only reason they did that was so that it would be easier. So the question is, basically, it sort of boils down, do we want to trust any CAs? There are some CAs that are trustworthy, but there are definitely many who aren't. DigiNotar, which is a big Dutch one that was responsible for the Dutch root CA at one point, I think, or at least some Dutch government CAs. And they essentially started signing these nonsense certificates for no reason. And then, yeah, so yes, there's a big problem there because there are certainly CAs that are currently trusted by your computer, by your computer and my computer, everybody's computer in the room, well, almost everyone probably, and they are not trustworthy. They have done things in the past, and they will probably do bad things in the future.
So, like any revocation policy for?
So there is a revocation policy, but unfortunately, well, you have these issues like there are these machines that never get updated. You know, there's this massive amounts of Windows XP before Service Pack 1, Windows XP Tomato in China. You know, there's massive amounts of boxes that will never get updated. And, you know, they have these terrible CAs, and if they're all running IE6 because that's the only thing that will run on it. So yeah, then if you constantly update your machines and you're running a recent version of Firefox and Chrome, then it's as good as it's going to get. But yes, there will be problems. For example, recently the whole DigiNotar thing, that was a serious issue.
And there was this case with Iran also?
Yes, I've heard something about that, but I don't know the details.
They spoofed Gmail or something like that.
They actually spoofed Gmail. Okay, I didn't hear that one. But okay, so apparently, so it was the Irish government or?
Iran.
Iran, okay, yeah. Yeah, I wouldn't be entirely surprised. I don't know if my machine trusts, but so it's standard OS X. I haven't done anything fancy with the certificates. I don't know if there's an Iranese certificate that's trusted. But yeah, it's certainly, like I said, it's certainly possible. If you trust their certificate, then they can do pretty much whatever they want.
I have a question.
Oh, sorry.
The GPG, right? It's based on like you trust somebody else, right? And so on and so on. So if you get some huge, I don't know, network of connections, there needs to be just one person that makes a mistake or something like that, and then the whole network's insecure, right?
No, because no, because, well, that depends what kind of mistake you're talking about. But for example, let's say that I have a GPG key, and everybody in the room signs it, and then one person makes, well, I don't know what kind of mistake you're thinking of, but then all of the other signatures are still there. So that one key is invalid, but my key can have multiple signatures. There are many, especially if you use GPG a lot and you go to a few key signing parties, then it's not unusual for your GPG key to have hundreds of signatures. So even if that if one of the key pairs that was used to sign one of those signatures, then if that key goes bad, if that key gets revoked, then nothing interesting happens. You have this one signature, and GPG tells you that, oh, well, by the way, this key's been revoked, so this signature is pointless, but okay, there's 100 other ones. If you have one signature, then okay, it's a bit of a problem, but yeah, the entire idea is to have as many signatures as possible, to have as thickly, a very thickly forested network of signatures, and then there's no real problem.
You can instruct GPG not to trust over 10 hops.
Right. Yeah. So that you only because otherwise, for example, you can have the issue that, well, I trust you, but I don't necessarily trust some guy that trusts some guy that trusts some guy that trusts some guy that eventually trusts you. So yeah, you can configure GPG to only go n deep, and then you have reasonable some level of certainty that at least those people are close to you signature-wise.
Then again, we have the issue that I can dress up like Michał and say I'm Michał, and you will meet me in person. I will sign the key, and you basically sign.
Yeah.
This whole issue of social engineering. And what's trust actually?
Yeah, that's what I was kind of thinking about that you can make a mistake and authorize somebody.
Sure. No, sure. So key signing parties, usually most people who sign keys try to take the authenticating the person as seriously as they can, usually in the form of photo ID. But the thing is, when a crypto system when the weakest point in an entire cryptographic system is the people, that means the crypto system's won, because you're never going to be able to eliminate the human factor. So yes, but it's not the case that one person making a mistake makes the entire thing fall down. It has to be a lot of people making that mistake. But you are correct in saying that if there's a direct link of mistakes to that one person, then you maybe be able to trust a key that isn't really trustworthy. Yes, that's true. But I also believe that GPG has a way of saying that you need more than that. You either need an ultimately trusted key, usually yourself, or basically you can configure it to be paranoid and say, oh well, I need 2 different paths to the same person. And before that's going to go wrong, then you're already talking about like ninja evil hacker aliens from space. So. It's certainly true that if you don't have some authority to defer to, then, well, yeah, you don't have some authority to defer to. But in practice, it tends to work quite well. Okay.